I'd like to talk about an absolutely critical topic which very few people seem to give the consideration that it really deserves, and that's childhood development. The earlier something occurs in an organism's development, the greater the compounded impact. And I believe that a lot of the problems we see in today's society can be traced back to unnatural child rearing practices. So let me just go over first some of the simpler examples of this, and then in the end I'd like to point out one of the child raising practices which is, in my opinion, the most unrecognized cause of problems. A simple example of an unnatural child raising practice is circumcision. Circumcision is only used by certain cultures around the world, by people who live in desert regions and don't have access to bathing water. In any other instance, the disadvantages of circumcision outweigh the benefits, and this has been proven for decades by science, and yet we continue circumcision based simply on an illogical tradition. And although circumcision isn't particularly risky, and it's only traumatic for a temporary period, it does serve as a good example of one of these practices which we continue without any benefit. Now, a lot of these practices developed kind of from a misguided psychology during the Victorian era, and it's no one's fault particularly that we've developed this way, but it is important to learn and to adjust. So the next practice I'd like to talk about is extremely dangerous, and again, not nearly as enough people seem to recognize the danger, and that's formula feeding infants. Now, even the worst pediatrician nowadays knows that you're not supposed to formula feed infants and that it is dangerous. But far too many pediatricians will simply say, oh yeah, breastfeeding is better and formula feeding is not as good, but no big deal. What pediatricians should be telling you is that formula feeding your baby doubles its chance of death. Doubles its chance of death, and really consider that. There are about 9,000 to 10,000 children that die in the United States every year unnecessarily because of formula feeding, and this has been proven, although it did take decades to finally do those studies and finally determine just how devastating the use of formula is. And unfortunately, by that time, formula had become widely accepted in society, and now it's hard to root out a practice that's already embedded like this. But again, just keep considering the fact that formula feeding doubles your child's chance of death. And also, it's been proven that formula feeding has lifelong impacts to a child's health and mental aptitude. Now, these impacts aren't quite as severe, but they are proven and they are lifelong impacts. Here's a fun exercise. Ask your pediatrician, what's the mortality rate for babies fed dairy-based formula versus babies fed soy-based formula versus babies fed formula with hydrolyzed protein in it versus the traditional practice of feeding raw goat's milk to babies? Your pediatrician won't have an answer for you because those studies have never been done, and really consider that. This is one of the most important things you could ever study, and it's also fairly easy to study, and yet nobody has an answer. So all in my opinion, all a qualified pediatrician or anyone from a scientific background could ever recommend is that you don't feed formula at all, and if you're going to feed formula, I guess you have to just kind of guess that whatever's closest to natural is best. Now, if people were truly conscious of the great risks associated with formula feeding, I'm sure we could set up some type of a system for distributing human breast milk, and although it would cost more, it would certainly be worth it when you consider the great risks of formula feeding. Unfortunately, society isn't fully conscious of these risks. One thing to consider, which unfortunately your pediatrician will probably never tell you, is that if you absolutely can't breastfeed, it is possible to obtain human breast milk and feed your child that way and reduce these lifelong problems. It certainly costs a lot more, and it's certainly difficult and may not always be possible for everyone, but working through groups like La Leche League or just your informal network of friends, and in some states there are actually milk banks where you can buy human breast milk. It seems strange because our entire society is brainwashed to believe that feeding soy extract is normal, but feeding someone else's breast milk is somehow odd. But when you really consider it, and you consider the enormous risks and the lifelong damage that is potentially done to your child by feeding formula, it doesn't sound so crazy anymore to consider paying the extra money and just feeding your child with natural human breast milk if you absolutely can't breastfeed. Next come some practices which are much less understood. And the first of these is the mother's and then the child's diet during early development. As I mentioned before, the earlier something occurs in an organism's development, the greater the magnified impact over the course of that organism's life. So it makes sense that most traditional cultures have specific guidelines for feeding expectant mothers and for feeding young children. A great book that everybody should read before they have children would be Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill by Udo Erasmus. It's a fairly misunderstood topic, and again, your medical professionals probably aren't going to fully inform you on these issues. Another great organization is the Weston Foundation. It's almost unparalleled wealth of information on traditional child-raising practices. One thing that traditional cultures often do is ensure that the expectant mother has a particularly clean and careful diet and is particularly careful to avoid foods that are toxic. You may want to look over my video, Food and Health and Intelligence, to learn a little bit more about that subject. Also, young children, we feed a fairly abnormal dietary ratio in our culture, and I believe that causes a lot of problems, along with feeding young children hydrogenated oil, which is absolutely the worst thing you can ever do. But in our society, we also feed fairly large amounts of dairy and large amounts of meat, and this is actually proven, although it's not publicized very often, it's proven to cause kind of an unnatural development in the child, because the hormones and the proteins and perhaps even unstudied cofactors in the meat and animal products cause the child to grow more rapidly and grow in a slightly abnormal manner. And this causes problems with organ development, and although it's not an enormous issue, it is proven that eating the relatively high ratios of meat and dairy which our children eat does have a slight negative impact on their lifelong health. So if you can consider that you should be particularly careful with your child's diet in giving them organic food and traditionally prepared food, and not just giving them, a bunch of garbage like conventional dairy products and conventional meat, which unfortunately so many of our children grow up on. You really have to study this in a lot more detail than I can go over in a video, though, and as I said, the Weston Foundation is a great resource on this, as well as reading the book Fats That Heal, Fats That Kill by Udo Erasmus. It looks like I'll have to leave the most misunderstood and potentially dangerous practices for the second half of this video, though.